I want to introduce another concept to you tonight. This concept is probably one of the most important concepts you could understand. This concept is called the triangle of health. So I'm going to draw you a nice pretty picture. I'm not a great artist, but you'll get the gist. So, the triangle of health, you all have one. Everybody has one. At the center or the core of this triangle are your genetics, your DNA. Now, how many times have you heard a doctor, in his frustration of not knowing what's wrong with you, want to jump directly to blaming DNA? You have bad genes, you're getting older, like these are the things that happen, right? These are the excuses for not being able to help you. Let's just make a little list over here. Excuses of not being able to help. So one is, you're getting older. 2, stress. 3, depression. 4, it's all in your genes. You just got bad genes. You just inherited crappy genes. Excuse my language, but that's, this is a point of frustration and contention for me. Because our genes are not evil. They're not bad. Our genes are what? Our genes are a gift. And that's the way I want you to look at it. Because if you look at it any way, and any differently, think of your genes, they're a gift from God. If you're not religious, they're still a gift because you're alive. And just the fact that you're alive is better than the fact that you're not alive. So your genes are a gift that are not designed to make you sick. Your genes are actually designed to do what they're told to do. In essence, your genes are largely influenced. Your DNA is influenced by this triangle. Let's talk a little bit more in depth about what this triangle means. So on one wall of this triangle, we have physical. On another wall of this triangle, we have the biochemical or chemical. And then on the last wall, we have spiritual / emotional. And each of these walls of the triangle influence the behavior of your genes. Now, the way I want you to understand your genes, aside from the fact that they're a gift, is that your genes are a lot like light switches. You can turn a light on, you can turn a light off, and it's not the gene or it's not the light that's necessarily bad. If I'm trying to go to bed, the light being off is a good thing. It's going to help me sleep. But if I'm trying to read a book, I want the light on. So it's not the gene. It's the circumstance around the gene. It's just like it's not the light, it's the circumstance around the light. It's no different here. If you are, for example, a diabetic, and you're making chemical choices every day to eat tons of sugar, to eat poorly, and to not exercise physically, what you're telling your DNA to do is to protect you from those choices. So what happens when you eat a lot of sugar? You activate the genes that help you make more insulin. What happens when you don't exercise physically? Your muscles atrophy and your ability to tolerate higher levels of blood sugar is minimized. But that makes diabetes worse. But what's happening is you're not exercising, so your genes are just adapting to your lack of physical activity by saying, look, you're not going to use any muscle. We're not going to spend a bunch of effort making extra muscle. So it's your choices that influence the behavior of those genetic light switches going off or on. And that's what leads to an outcome. Now, what doctors love to call disease, and let me make a little bit more room on the top here. Because doctors love to blame these things on why a person might get sick. But the reality is, disease is your body adapting to poor behavior. And really, it's not even necessarily that it's poor behavior, but it's behavior that you are having that doesn't accommodate the genetic light switches in a manner that's consistent with the expression of good health. For example, I'm going to give you a very acute example here, and it'll make better sense in a minute. If you go underwater and try to breathe, what's going to happen? You're going to drown. If you jump off a cliff and try to fly, you're going to fall. You're not going to grow wings. You're not going to grow gills if you go underwater. Your genes are not going to adapt to a poor behavioral choice acutely. In essence, what will happen is you'll drown or you'll fall to your doom. That's not disease, that's death. But if we take chronic disease, so that's an acute example, meaning a quick example. If we take chronic disease, which is poor exercise, poor diet over time, your body is adapting to your poor behaviors, and the symptomatic outcome of your poor behaviors is what we call disease. And so then doctors will classify you with a name, and then that disease classification just basically serves to identify which drug we can use to artificially manipulate your chemistry so that we don't have to have an uncomfortable conversation about changing your behavior. How many times have you been to the doctor where they don't even have a meaningful conversation? How many of you, let's just ask that question to the audience, how many of you been to a doctor where they gave you medication but they didn't sit down and talk to you about exercise, what kind of exercise? They didn't sit down and talk to you about diet, what kind of diet that you needed to follow? If you've never really had the opportunity, or you've been to a doctor and you haven't had that conversation, what I want you to type in is just #disease. If disease is really your body's loss of ability to adapt to bad choices, because that's the way, if we want to really boil it down, disease is the loss of your ability to adapt to your choices. So your body can no longer keep up with your bad choices, and then it starts to become symptomatic. Those symptoms are just a manifestation of your body's warning system. Your body is screaming at you saying, stop it, do something different. I want you to understand, again, we've got 3 different walls of this triangle, and each one is worth 33% of your health minus your genetics. So, I mean, if we ask most geneticists and most researchers, they're going to tell you that your disease, whether or not you develop autoimmune disease, whether or not you develop chronic degenerative disease, is not so much genetic, although genetics can play a role. There's definitely a role genetics plays. But most agree that if we're doing the math on this, that about 30% of the total risk comes from genetic undertone, and 70% comes from the choices that we make on a daily basis. So my point in saying that is you are far more empowered at making changes in your environment to influence the behavior of your genes than you are to change your genes. So we can't change what our DNA is, but we can change how it's being influenced, right? And so when we take and make different physical, chemical, spiritual, emotional choices, this is actually what we're trying to do. And this is what functional medicine is all about. Those of you who've ever heard of functional medicine, it's the application of the 3 walls of this triangle to influence the behavior of your genetic code so that we're expressing health instead of illness. Now, we're trying to get you in this direction. So understand this, that disease and illness and health, really the whole spectrum of health, it very much is a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, we have perfection. On the other end of the spectrum, we have death. And if you're watching this show, you're not perfect. None of us are. And if you're watching the show, you aren't dead. So you're always going to be somewhere between perfection and death. Always. We all are. But it's where on the spectrum you fall. If we want to feel good, if we want to have good function, if we want to be adaptive, we call that zone here wellness. And that's where most people they're striving to achieve a state of wellness. Wellness doesn't mean perfect. It doesn't mean you can't get sick. It doesn't mean that you never, or that you feel good 100% of the time. But wellness means that you can adapt really, really well in your environment and thrive in your environment, as opposed to the opposite. On the other end of the spectrum, there's functional illness. And this is where the vast majority of Americans fall. The vast majority of people that live in industrialized countries fall in this functional illness category, meaning they can get up, go to work, they can brush their teeth, they can put their shoes on, get dressed, but they feel bad and they have chronic illness. They have some form of either chronic autoimmune disease or some form of chronic behavioral disease, and they don't feel well. And it's not a very far step from here to death. I mean, this is when a person's on multiple medications. This is when a person is basically masking the symptoms of their disease by suppressing the symptoms with drugs to stay alive longer, but they still are not achieving great health. Whereas over here, this is the person that is identifying their choices and where they can make better choices. and where they're making bad choices, and so they can start making different choices to basically nourish their DNA to express in this direction. Hey, and if you missed the earlier part of this series, click right here so you can go back and get caught up. The information there might be critical to helping you on your path to better health. And as always, thanks for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe for updates below. Have a great day.